All right. Well, hello, John.
Hello, Joel.
I want to add just a teeny bit to Anthony's introduction. So I have been very lucky to know John Lysaker for we're going to be coming up on 20 years here pretty soon, which is yes, I clutch my pearls as well at that. Time really doesn't stop. But one of the reasons I'm so grateful to have known John this long, and this will come out, I think, in the event today, is that whether I'm talking with him about music, philosophy, art, life, relationships, or whatnot, he always proves to be an amazing interlocutor. And I often come away not just having changed my mind or feeling as though I've kind of grown intellectually, but often feeling changed as a person, feeling like I have actually been transformed in some way. And that is, I think, a kind of telling way to enter into talking about this fantastic book, Hope, Trust, and Forgiveness, Essays in Finitude, that came out with the University of Chicago Press. And I want to start with a real, this is going to be easy question. What led you to write on these topics, John? And what do they have in common?
So thanks, Joel. Thanks for arranging this. Thanks for being such a good student, now friend, for such a long time. So it's a real pleasure to be able to talk about this with you. Let's see. Lots of different things. One is they're difficult. They're difficult to think about philosophically, but they're difficult existentially. We often lose our way in wondering about whether to trust someone or what it means to be trustworthy for someone who maybe doesn't always deserve our trust, or to maintain hope when the world seems to want to crush it, or to work through having been wronged and hurt by someone, and whether or not we want to go on with them, and under what terms do we want to go on with them. So one is I find them existentially challenging. They're also curious philosophically. Neither is simply voluntary nor involuntary. They're not completely not up to us, but we've all wanted to maintain hope or trust someone or forgive someone and found ourselves unable to. That's sort of a startling thing when we tend to separate out the moral as only concerning the voluntary. So already that's a puzzle. The second one is that I don't think either is particularly helped out by either principled versions of ethics or deference to convention. And those are the two main ways of thinking about where norms come from. The German moralität, right? They're universalizable principles that we can articulate, or some bed of conventions. And I think you can line up all the conventions, you can line up all the principles, and that won't always resolve for us what we should hope for, whether we should hope, whether we should abandon a particular hope, who we should trust, who we shouldn't, whether we should forgive. I realize that's slightly more contentious. Some people do think we're obligated to forgive if people check all the conditions, but that's not my view. So existentially challenging, philosophically curious. And I'll add one other thing. I think they particularly hope. There's a way in which there's a kind of conference cool distance from the idea of being a hopeful person. And I think we throw shade on hope at our own peril. So I thought that one needed in particular. That's what really started the project. And then as I got going, I thought, well, there's something similar. And I named some of the similarities. I lied. I got one other thought, and that is, in each of them, when you hope well, when you trust well, when you forgive well, you're doing something in the midst of finitude. And there's a kind of, I'm still happy to go with Aristotle on kalan and thinking about there being something like ethical beauty in human action that we can even appreciate and recognize each other's when we say of someone they're a beautiful person. And I think there's something particularly humanly beautiful in someone who maintains and acts out of hope, in someone who entrusts part of their welfare to another, and in someone who says, you wronged me and you're not quite who I thought you were, but I think we still can go on together. And I'm committed to being vulnerable, to being harmed again. And that's part of what forgiveness is. So there's something really, I think, special about finite moral beauty in how we conduct ourselves in each of these when we hit the mark.
That's such a great way to open this event. And yeah, and I noticed there's more than one moment where beauty comes up, and especially the kind of the beauty of a certain sort of fragility and finitude. And I hope we'll be able to circle back to that in a bit. I want to, before we jump in to kind of the meat of some of the content and the specific themes, I think it's very important to notice and think about the structure of this book. And you have been thinking very deeply, deeper than certainly anyone I've read in the last few decades, about the relationship between form and genre and the activity of philosophy, the activity of writing, and even what it means to be a person. And so you address hope, trust, and forgiveness in a form, I would be willing to say a genre, that you call the aphor essay, APHOR dash essay. What does that involve? And why did you choose to write the book in that way? What are the stakes of that?
Yeah, so part of it is I wrote a book in 2018, Philosophy Writing and the Character of Thought, and complained, said no one falls in love with philosophy to write journal articles. Apologies to anyone who that's not true of, but it was a meta reflection. It was a reflection on writing, and this is sort of where I worked out this way of writing. But it would be a kind of a cheat to exhort people to write differently and then to only do it by writing about writing. So partly I felt I owed it to myself and to anyone who took me seriously to try to show that you could do first order philosophy, make contributions to enduring philosophical topics in a variety of different ways. So that's one thing. The next thing is that each of these phenomena often are called spectrum phenomena. Very few people who still write on them think they can produce the necessary and sufficient conditions for counting as an act of trust, an act of hope, or an act of forgiveness. Usage is too vast, it's too differential. And as I thought about it more, if we're ethicists, if we're writing about this in ethics, I'm not an anthropologist. My point is not to catalog all the usages and find a definition which somehow magnetically draws them in. The point is to help orient us in conduct with insights. And so that might mean, I know we talk this way about trust, but maybe we shouldn't. Or this is one way to think about hope, but don't think about it that way. No one's going to correct your use of the word, but you'll be morally better off if you follow a different path. So one is just the diversity of usages that are out there. I wanted to acknowledge, to mark, to negotiate with, and that required, I thought, me to come at it in a variety of different angles. The next two things are, as I argued in the previous book, when you're writing philosophy, you're addressing a topic, and so you have to be appropriate to the topic, but you also have an addressee on the other side and a differential field of addressees. And I thought that a varied set of forms and presentations would reach different addressees and would engage them in ways. I'm very drawn, as you know, to Emerson and also to Nietzsche, but at one very particular level. They write to the reader, and the reader feels personally summoned into what they're talking about. And so I wanted to be able to hit that, but you can't sustain that tone of voice or that intimacy. I already feel like I'm pushing it with this book because of just how long each of the sections are. But how are you going to summon someone into a kind of intimacy where they are going to allow themselves to be vulnerable about ethical issues relative to a set of reflections and examples? And so that required a shorter, more varied way to go. And then the last thing, my claim was, you're always addressing the moment you're in. And I think we're in a lot of different moments, but I wanted to write in a way that conveyed a humble moral seriousness, where I'm very serious about the topics, but I'm not trying to proclaim from on high that I've settled things. Right. And then I guess the last thing is I've come really to think, and I write this at one point, think about a philosophical text as a musical score that you're being invited to perform in order to see what you can then do with it. And that's an ethical commitment. I'm not, as a philosopher, trying to replace someone's conscience and provide them with the conclusions to their own dilemmas. I'm trying to reinvigorate beginnings, right? Reinitiate a set of processes, hopefully leave someone more enriched. But we all know the final word will never be any philosophical texts. And the more powerful the philosophical word, the more it will invite contestation, because it will open things up and the full complexity of the situation will announce itself, and no one will ever be adequate to that. So there's certain ethical reasons for writing this way. There's rhetorical reasons about trying to maintain intimacy. And I just think each of these topics requires it. And I'd be lying if I didn't say I've come to like writing this way. And I'm going to continue until I think it's just become shtick, and then I need to change gears. But it still seems vital to me. It still seems like stuff happens in writing this way that couldn't happen if I went in more of a cover your ass kind of form. Because all of a sudden, as you know, you're at 45 pages and you only said a little of what you wanted to say.
Yes.
And I thought if I condense it in this way, break it up, I can be more ambitious. It's more vulnerable. But we're here to work through things together. I'm not here to, tell you in the end how your life's going to shine or dim.
Yeah, and the vulnerability really comes through. I mean, there are so many points where I felt like I was in your uncertainty about exactly how something is shaking out or the right way to go. And I was like there with you. And I'm like, wow, I can't remember the last time I felt this reading a philosophical text, especially a journal article, which is usually like, an exercise in fighting off every single possible thing so that your account stands at the end. It was very much in some ways the opposite of that.
I
wanted
throw one thing in?
Oh,
Sorry.
please. Yeah.
Is that just like Aristotle says, right? In ethics, there's only a certain amount of precision that we're capable of. And where are we in that not quite epistemic precision, right? Right? There's no real episteme open to ethics for him. And so there, I think Beauvoir is right. We're in ambiguity. And so this is sort of me at one level marrying reading Ethics of Ambiguity and reading the Ethics and allowing that ambiguity to appear, because acknowledging it is I think part of establishing oneself as trustworthy. There's a performative point here. But that's also a mode of moral maturity. People who continually suppress the ambiguity are not, in my view, morally mature.
So I want to jump into talking specifically about the three primary themes. And let's begin, as you do, with hope. You term at one point your account of hope romantic. And to some ears, they might not quite know what you mean by that. So I just want to give you a chance to talk about what you mean by that and what's distinctive about that view. And of course, I'm particularly curious about how it relates to Jonathan Lear's notion of radical hope.
Yeah, so the romantic is tied to romanticism in a path. This is a potentially incredibly long, complicated thing. Romanticism is a very, very global event. We tend to set it off into national languages and literatures, but it gets so messy so quickly. The second generation German Romanticism is already ingesting American Romanticism, and American Romanticism is ingesting British and German. It's going into various Latin American countries. So, there's a way in which I'm interested in that line of thought. It begins with the idea that Emerson captures it beautifully. I know I am a fragment, and this is a fragment of me. What I call in the book partiality. It embraces a kind of partiality, both that I'm a part of a larger whole, and I can't really know the whole, but I know enough to know that I'm a part. And then secondly, my perspective is always partial. The whole is never going to be given to me. and I act out of that kind of partiality. So that's part of it. There's the epistemology, the fragment side, but Romanticism also has a kind of ambition. The translation of genius into practical power. That's the way Emerson puts it. Both of those are from experience. And I'm committed to both of those. Not being undone by partiality, but trying to find a way that we still try to translate the flash of insight we get every now and then into conduct, such that conduct finds better traction in the world toward the ends we want to see realized. So that's the sort of the romantic kind of hope is how does hope function in that way? You know, and it readies us, it focuses us, it inclines us, and it's an intensifier of agency and imagination. And yet Jonathan Lear's book on radical hope is powerful. And, you know, on each of these topics, I got to tell you, researching them, there's a lot of smart stuff on it. And that's why I wanted to write more in a collaborative way. Like I think I build on what people say more than I pick fights, you know, and I try to be, you know, cautious in pointing out disagreements. And if I do find a disagreement, I try to always then say, but I think we're closer over here. But in the end, I think there are a few things that Lear's book is committed to that I'm worried about. One is it's somewhat heroic. Radical hope tends to be isolated individuals casting an imaginative dream into an empty abyss almost. And that's why I look at what Pretty Shield has to do from The Crow and to say, you know, hope is really nourished and fused and in part instructed by the everyday life of supports that we get from love and from family and from friendships, even from the weather at times. There's a way in which hope, even when it needs to be radical, is so materially dependent on material and interpersonal orders. And I think he renders it overly cognitive and overly individual. Mm-hmm. And so the romantic, because it's tied to the fragment and the sense of partiality, that's a way of me affirming heteronomy. And I got a big fight with heteronomy through the whole book. I don't like calling that way because I think even the idea of the nomos, that we're bounded by a nomos on autonomy or heteronomy, needs to be kicked to the curb. But there's a way in which my hope is embracing its really radical dependencies as a source for hope. And part of the moral beauty of it is I'm conspiring with whatever finitude gives me in order to have a future that's better than I would have otherwise had. And that's why in classical Greece, there are lots of moments where they hate hope because it's all fading. It's going to be a slapstick event. And you're going to be, there's a way in which lots of Greek tragedy could just be a slapstick if you cast it the right way. So-and-so thought he knew what was going on, but no. So that's really, the key of the difference. Material, emotional dependency, that it's not so cognitive.
Yeah. This theme of doubling down on the interdependent and interpersonal aspects of these phenomena, this continues with your account of trust, which I was very taken by. But there's one part I want to kind of ask you about and maybe push you on, partially because it was just something I really struggled with in reading through that section. So at one point you talk about Basil Distrust. Am I pronouncing that word correctly?
Basil. Yeah.
Yeah. It's such a great herb. Basil, Basal, distrust. And you introduce the term through Karen Jones's framing of it as trust in the world being shattered. And you kind of are, you're like, I see the point, but I disagree. And you say, look, Basil distrust exits the specific and absorbs it. It does not concern the particular, but the general vulnerability that's a part of all dependence relations. And you say at one point, you're like, I don't think I've experienced betrayal. I have definitely experienced betrayal. And I feel like I get very viscerally the sense of Basil distrust, where you feel like your whole world has collapsed and all of the fibers and
Right.
like everything goes away. And so I wonder if, if you say trust is an atmosphere, isn't Basil distrust like a vacuum? And so, yes, I get why you want to say it's not a species of trust, but yeah, I just want to, I
Yeah,
still feel
let
like
me,
Basil
so
distrust is a
I
species of,
don't want to say there's no such thing as Basil distrust,
okay.
because I do think that's exactly what that's sort of when I lay it out. In when you've been deeply betrayed, all the secure relations start to fall away. And this is the way people report the experience of trauma. The question is whether or not there was a thing called Basil trust, which had been broken. And
Gotcha.
that's what I'm resisting.
Okay.
And it makes a huge clinical difference, because if it wasn't ever there, you don't want to work really hard to repair it.
Right.
And that's sort of, so my sense is there isn't Basil trust, but I get that kind of, that global distrust is absolutely, you should, if that's what I've somehow said, you should call me, reach through the phone and smack me around a little, because that's just overtly clinically false. But it's about what's being broken by that. And the parallel to this, though, is there's a tendency to think all of social life is held together by trust. And I just think that's ideology. That's a way to try to pretend that completely competitive, gamble-ridden social order is somehow we're secretly intersubjectively available to each other and sending out waves of trust. And I don't think most social cooperation is predicated on trust at all. And it gets my hackles up when it's kind of suggested, because that's an attempt to put this glaze of considered cooperation over, that's not happening when I go to Target.
And hopefully we will get to come back to in just a few moments what happens to you when you do go to Target. I just want to hear more. So thank you.
Leave. Yeah.
So thank you for that clarification. That I definitely was misreading part of that. That helps me a lot. And it also, so especially when this was happening in the hope section, but also the trust section, is because of the way you set up these interludes, I then kept coming back to questions of the world and kind of epistemic surety or lack thereof, and also the relationship to self. So let me use that as an entry point to discuss what you call the interludes, right? So we've got 3 topics and we've got 2 interludes. And as I reflected on the experience of reading through the book, I originally I kind of thought of those as like the glue. And then I thought about it more and I'm like, no, I think they're actually ballasts, and they're ballasts that are for far more than the 3 topics that you choose, right? The extent to which I think there is a shared world, and the very, very about as high ramifications as you can get consequences of that, of whether or not I'm a skeptic about that. And also this relationship, the relationship I have to who I have been, am, and will be, and the extent to which I do think there is a task, perhaps a perfectionist task, in that relationship. So let's, I'm saying way too much. Can you just talk about the interludes, the role that they play in the larger project, and why they're in there?
Yeah, so I'm sure you've given talks, and a significant percentage of the questions concern some basic philosophical issues that you couldn't address in the talk because of your focus. And so it's common at this point, and it's been common since I've been in graduate school, to ask, where are you speaking when you say those sorts of things? And the idea is, and this is important for me because of the epistemic of the fragment, right? The partiality of our perspectives. But I think that happens in a shared world, and you can only recognize that there is partiality and difference if you share a world. This is kind of a Davidson argument, 1975, I think. But it's very common, I think, still to reassert the kind of discrete nature of worldviews, vocabularies, paradigms, discourses, languages, whatever the general, I call that the paradigm of the paradigm, whatever the general orientation or perspective is. And they're so discrete that it makes it impossible, and in fact, potentially violent, to philosophize in a representative way, which is to say, hey, you address A, I'm saying something that may be of value to you. And so part of it is to prevent that kind of worldview relativism. That's been a concern of mine. It's a concern of Husserl's. It's a concern of Horkheimer's, sort of, continuing on. So one is just to say that and I try to really struggle with this then at other points if I talk about proximities, and just how the very idea of recognizing difference is only possible in a shared world. And also, there has to be a validity term. What am I doing when am I trying to get hope more or less right? Am I trying to get trust more or less right? So I felt like I had to say something about truth. And I felt as if our willingness to be utterly committed to a major validity term, justice, but to not care about truth is a kind of mistake. So I thought I'd come in on behalf of a certain kind of truth over and against this deflationary view coming out of Rorty, which I have in print when I was a youngster defended. And then the second one is, if going back to the After essay, someone might say, what do you do? How is this even ethics? Like, you're dealing topics, it looks like trying to do well, but the style seems so overly performative and indulgent. How does this fit as a kind of ethics? And if you run a certain line out of Emerson into Cabell, there's a way in which, and I'm not ultimately Cabellian about this, but working with ordinary language, working with usages, that could include for me song lyrics and quotes from books. The book could be by the Pope, it could be the Bible, it could be a philosopher, it could be something a friend of mine said. When you're experimenting with usages and you're trying to not provide any deep resolution to what it would mean to excel at either of these activities, what are you doing as an ethicist? And for me, this book is partially me accounting for myself as I try to hope well, trust well, and forgive well. And so the very ethical project is perfectionist, and I wanted to give an account of that. I do view that as a way of inheriting Aristotle through Beauvoir, because Aristotle's just usages. Some people say things that happen after your death might prove that you weren't actually flourishing. What should we do about that? He doesn't quote someone. He's like, I keep running into this in where I live, and so I'm going to bring it up. Or sometimes the poets say this, or sometimes this friend we don't want to name who we disagree with says something. You see what I mean? So the perfectionist interlude is, you're probably wondering what the hell I'm doing. How is this going to count as ethics? And I try to move towards this improvisational perfectionism as a way of explaining what it means to do ethics, where you experiment and improvise with usages, but still try to make representative contributions in a shared world.
Can you say a little bit more about perfectionism? And part of the reason I ask is I'll just admit that in years past, this term always tripped me up, because sometimes people would use it as if I should know what that means in the same way that I know what virtue ethics, utilitarianism, or deontology means. And so I just, for those who still feel like they don't have a good grasp on what it means to say I'm giving a perfectionist account or what perfectionism is, can you give a bit of a gloss? And I think that will be helpful for at least some in the audience.
Yeah, and so I think the more classical view of perfectionism is become who you are. Pindar, you're allotted something by fate, and it's up to you to fully realize it. And that's a kind of essentialist humanist perfectionism. That doesn't really hold anymore. And so some people have gotten rid of the idea that there's something even there to perfect. When Cabell inherits it, he wants to say, well, it's more that I'm continually giving an account and I'm answerable for who I am becoming. So sometimes that's why I put it in terms of become who you are becoming. Or when I'm in a cranky mood, I call it become who you are not. Because I think part of the real energy is about surpassing who you had been up to a certain point. Now, I don't like the language of perfectionism because it still sounds like, in the end, John thinks he's perfect, or the goal is perfection, and that's not really it. So I'd be happy to try to, that's why when I wrote my book on Emerson and self-culture, I just wanted to call it self-culture. I didn't want to call it perfectionism. But there's Cavell's the smart person who is influential on me, and there are a host of other authors who use it in an affirmative way. And I wanted to maintain that proximity. And so it's a complicated, but it really has to do with I'm fundamentally answerable for who I am in at least 4 ways, right? What I do, how I justify what I do, what I omit doing, and what my life actually reproduces. I can't remember now. If I were a really good author, I would remember. I list these all toward the end of that essay. So let me actually, I want to get this right. Sorry. So I call it the overt. So perfectionism is grounded in a fundamental experience of answerability or accountability. The overt, choices, actions, the manner of one's deeds, beliefs, and refusals. The implicit, indirect endorsements, unhappy complicities, crimes of omission. The incipient, what we enable or could enable but fail to pursue. And not just for us. This is sort of, because we all know we are a variable that other people have to live with. I love this in Emerson, the conduct of life. My conduct conducts life, and for a lot more than me, and I'm answerable for that. And the last one is the reflexive, the terms with which we deliberate, agree, converse, commit, revise, praise, blame, apologize, or wash our hands. So there's a radical answerability, right, for this fragment that knows it's a fragment.
That's super helpful, John. And sorry for muting myself, but of course, there's both a garbage truck and a ambulance right outside my window now, as life would have it.
Yeah, I'm taking those both allegorically.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
You know, the only thing that can solve what's going on in my life right now is I need to go to Target. That's going to do it. So I want to make sure we have time to talk about forgiveness. So you suggest that forgiveness is more about the future than the past. And you also say here, borrowing a term that Cavell loves, that it's best thought of as a kind of remarriage.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear what you mean. And before you answer, I do want to cite one of my, it's very hard to pick a favorite line from the book, but this one's definitely up there. This is on page 206. And the section title of this component of an Afar essay is Ecce Homo. And you write, we are fragile, dependent beings, each perch a limit. Hope affirms our lot in its weakness and ignorance. Trust affirms shared vulnerability. Forgiveness finds new life in failure. Here we flower as no rose ever could. Ugh, gorgeous. Forgiveness, it finds new life in failure, more about a future than a past. Yeah, say a bit more.
Yeah, so some of the forgiveness literature suggests like it's a return to, you know, that era has been wiped clean and now we're good again. And it looks back and it says like, well, you know, I'm not going to hold, you know, I'm not going to continue to resent that you wronged me. And that resentment is not going to fundamentally influence my regard for you. So, but of course, for me, what I argue is that hurts are disclosive of us, that people hurt and wrong us is disclosive of them. And these should belong to an ongoing learning curve. And that's why I borrow from MLK, catalytic, right? Forgiveness is, right? It catalyzes us, and it's about creating a future given what we learned about ourselves. I tend to think that sort of sense of let's go backward, the debit sheet is erased view of forgiveness. It's just too easy because it's as if nothing were disclosed about either of us in that event. But I think we grow and learn, and there's a real intimacy to having been wronged by someone and to looking at them and like you, and for someone to feel the accusation of them having wronged one. And so I really think when you forgive, it's a way of deciding not that whatever happened we can deal with, but it's that we want to go on together and we're going to articulate the terms under which we're going to go on together. And those could range from, don't worry about it, it happens, I could tell you were in a bad spot, to, hey, stop being an asshole, to, if you do that again, we're through. So I just think there's this whole learning process could open up in what I call scenes of forgiveness. And those tend to be diminished in most of the accounts that I read. That also means if you want to be forgiven, that also means there's a different kind of vulnerability. I think that it's not just sort of, I'm sorry, I did all of my, humiliating apologies and now we're good, right? That idea that forgiveness is we're good, right? It's like, no, we got to face what just happened and figure out how to go on together. And I think sometimes we forgive because it's just easier. Now, everyone who knows me who's on this session, and I appreciate everyone being here, they're like, I knew it, he holds grudges. But that's not what I'm saying. It's just that one works through those. They're disclosive. And we should be up to what's disclosed in that. And a lot of it is, the last thing I'll say about this is, when someone's been really hurt or betrayed, the people I'm knowing, they're ashamed. How can I be so stupid? And what they're experiencing is their own vulnerability. And they're recoiling from it. But since so much of the book is also about the beauty of being a vulnerable, trustworthy, hopeful collaborator, we should not be ashamed of having allowed ourselves to be hurt in that way. But we should learn and decide whether we want to go on together. And I guess the last thing too is, it may be that the moral understanding we each had of our relationship is insufficient. And that needs to be revised as well going forward. So the go back to equality sounds like, well, our moral register is just fine. Well, maybe it's not. And that's really the Cavell remarriage. The remarriage comedies are, we got married under certain conventional terms, and they weren't really adequate to allow the women in the film to be who they were becoming. And so it had to rupture. And, sometimes the woman comes into her own and finds whether relationships worth sustaining, Philadelphia Story, or sometimes the man has to get his head out of his ass, the awful truth, and see, oh man, I'm with Irene Dunn. She's a genius comedian. I need to spend my days with her and allow her to be who she needs to be. Does that get at it? Sorry, I realize these are compressed.
Yeah, no, that's great. There are many more questions I would like to ask you, but I need to be a good interviewer host, and I want to shift over to the Q&A.
Right. You know where I live.
Well, yeah, from our audience. So we've got a question, and if I'm pronouncing people's names wrong, please forgive me, from Andre Sanchez. And he writes, or they write, Anthony mentioned your previous work on schizophrenia. Are there any ways in which you can link schizophrenia or perhaps depression to questions of hope, trust, and forgiveness? And part of the reason I'm picking this question, John, is I do think there might be some people out there where if they've only read your single authored monographs, they might not realize all this rich body of work you've done in this psychopathology space. So I also wanted to give you an explicit chance to mention that slice of work of yours.
Yeah, so that's the work I did with my brother, Paul Lysaker. It's a collaborative process. Mostly, actually, Paul was the driving force in that. I sort of was a conceptual pruning device. I think the questions of how hope in particular can occur under conditions of deep duress is certainly, if it's a dependent phenomenon that really is situational and individuates us, by which I mean, I can't hope for you. I can be a variable that maybe allows your world to be more hopeful or less hopeful, but we're really individuated in each of these. No one can do them for us. So they're part of what I call the personal, which is something I've been laboring on in a variety of ways. Depression, trauma, psychosis, schizophrenia, those are all conditions which are fraught, and it's hard to win trust. It's hard to find hope. And so the continuity is, what really drew me was just trying to think about how does a life hold itself together and aspire under that duress, some of which is internal, but some of which is very social, either in terms of previous traumas, perhaps in terms of insufficient social support, and then also in terms of stigma. So those would all be, if I wanted to look at any of these terms, I'd want to get into what are the various forces that beset persons suffering in that way. But also, let's not forget they are undergoing that suffering, and they have capacities to, and other networks that can empower or disempower them as they struggle. So, the last thing, I guess that's the, we'd have to get in to the specificity of the challenges that those bring. One of the things that happens partially with real psychosis is just the difficulty to even have a future, or to have a future being on the imaginative horizon, because the present is so beset. So maybe we might then think about how a certain therapeutic intervention is part about allowing someone to experience themselves as a person with a future of their own. And that certainly runs very much in line with the work that Paul and I and a bunch of other colleagues have done.
So I've got two questions that I think I'm gonna ask them both and then let you play with them as you see fit. One is from an anonymous attendee who asks, do we live in a world that's less forgiving than it used to be? And if so, what's going on such that it's less forgiving? I find that question quite intriguing. And then another one, I can't tell if this is in the same vein or quite distinct, but I'll let you figure that out. From Alice Tamimi. Thanks for this conversation. John, I'm interested in how you respond to hopelessness, how you, John, respond to hopelessness, whether brief episodes in your own life, the writings of someone committed to, say, pessimism or misanthropy. What, in short, is the value, if any, of hopelessness? So there's both a personal aspect to that question and then bouncing back out.
Yeah, so I don't know if we're less forgiving. We certainly love the spectacle of public humiliation, shame, reality TV. So I think people are very strategic and pounce on moments of weakness for political advantage, or there's a kind of real, I think, broad cultural sadism, from Ultimate Fighting to reality TV shows where, sure, someone gets the trophy, but most people get eviscerated, and I presume that's part of the fun. So I don't know. And whether we were more forgiving, were we forgiving in a remarriage sense? Or were we forgiving in a way of like, well, I'm going to pretend I forgive. I love technology. That's when the dimness inside starts to appear.
And then he disappeared.
And then he disappeared into hopelessness, which is the next question. I don't know, because there might be moments where there's some articles which are quite good on how people pretend to forgive just to get by because they're in a vulnerable position and they're under the authority and power of another. So they're like, it was nothing. It's okay. I forgive you. But they're really under duress. I don't think those are genuine acts of forgiveness. So I don't know, because if the more forgiving world was also the more unjust world, people just putting up with shit they never should have had to put up with, I don't quite know. So I just don't know. I'm very aspirational though, so but I am trying to. And by the way, just so it's clear, I make a lot of space for not forgiving. And then what you have to do when you withhold forgiveness. Some people act like withholding forgiveness is exiling people from the moral universe or something. That makes your life a lot more complicated, because now you still have to figure out how to go on with them, but in very different ways. So I just don't know. Yeah, hopelessness, it happens. We can't just in a voluntary way be hopeful. And there's a way in which hope can be naive. And hope can lead to wishful thinking. So there are ways in which you can be hopeful in a way that's not what we, ultimately want to praise or pursue or encourage. I worry, though, I tend to think about terms as always on a continuum. So to think hope is also to think despair. So there's trust, but then what is not trust? That's sort of suspicion or cynicism or skepticism. There doesn't just have to be one word. And then there's forgiveness and there's resentment. And then there's also like revenge, which just sort of like exists in a different kind of world. So if we're not hopeful, what are we then? I think sometimes you can be faithful. This is a more complicated discussion, because hope has to deal with the plausible. You don't hope for things that aren't possible. Faith can deal with the impossible, the unimaginable. So if I completely abandon hope, what is it my agency is going to conspire with? That might just be that might be despair. It might just be a stoic withdrawal. It might be an abandonment of any world that I would conspire with in a second order hope for what might yet to come. And maybe that's a kind of faith. But the last thing I'll say on this is, but what are we really giving up hope in? Are we really giving up hope overall, or do we really mean I don't have hope for the political regime or politics in general? And I talk a little bit about this in the book, that if hope expands to horizons where we really have no idea how the world moves or works, then I think you're courting despair. And hope really moves in with the imaginable and the probabilistic. And genuine, true hopelessness. I cite this Anne Sexton poem where she's just like, she's undone. And her whole future is just sort of is eclipsed. I wanted to quote Slip Sliding Away, but Chicago makes you get permission for everything. And half the people don't respond, and some they respond and they want an enormous amount of money. Because people are buying it so they could read the lyrics in my book, because that's really where they come into their own. Anyway, so despair, how global is it? Or are we really just saying, I don't even know anymore whether I have hopes for national politics for a country of over 300 million people? I definitely get that. You might withdraw hope from the political. And one of the essays by Calvin Warren that I talk about does this. It's like, to tell me to keep having hope in the political is inviting me to a bait and switch. And I want the full ambiguity of the word switch to be heard in that. And that I get, but is that a global abandonment? Not in the essay that I quote. Is it like, do I have no hopes for this particular conversation? Again, when you are hoped, it energizes. And I think it becomes a differential variable in the future that we will then have to conspire with as well. But if someone says, I'm hopeless, you might just hug them. I'm not going to go in and tell someone they ought to be hopeful or they should be hopeful. But I wanted to write in a way to say we lose a lot if hope leaves our basic existential orientation.
So unfortunately, we have to be mindful of time. I want to take one more question from the audience, but then I'm going to pair it with one of my own. And then I'll let you decide how you want to parse up the time. So the question from the audience comes from Steve Gaunt, and they write, what did the writing process entail for this book, especially the shorter sections? Was it in random spurts? Did you cover each chapter topic one at a time? I like this question about the kind of creative process behind a book that is this creative. And then what I want to pair that with is just an open invitation of, was there something you wanted to say that you didn't have a chance to yet? Is there a question you want to pose to yourself that I did not pose to you that you would then also like to answer in response to yourself? Just, I want to give you the final final little bit of space here.
Okay, sure. So Joel, Steve was finished his thesis with me last year, and he's applying to graduate school now. And he himself wrote a very creative thesis. So I did produce a text on each topic because I read a lot. And what I would do is I'd read and take notes, and every section would expand and then I'd shrink it. Every section would expand and I'd shrink it. And I knew that rendered me vulnerable, but I always felt like there was more I could say if someone ever asked me. But then once then I wrote the interludes. But then once I had the whole, I started to let them work on each other. And that led to adjustments. There are not so many comparative things because I don't have a through line argument in that way. Say about interesting, reflexive emotions. What are these? Are they emotions? They're both cognitive at the same time. They're all erotically charged. Like Annette Beyer says, they kind of make a mockery of faculty psychology. So each one got their own, me navigating a conversation. And then once they were all together, they put a lot of pressure on each other. The short ones, sometimes they just come out, and it's true. Sometimes I'll think in an aphorism and I'll write it down. Most of them get refashioned or chiseled a little. You want to leave it, it should feel spontaneous. A labored aphorism is a painful thing. Steve, as I've told you 8 million times, revision, that's all I keep doing. And there are errors in it. I would keep revising. If you see my copy, I'm like, oh, get rid of that. So there's a lot of part-whole dynamics, just so it holds together, even though it isn't a linear progression. And that goes with playing with words or with sounds or recurring images or the way different authors appear, giving a poet, Terence Hayes, something in the first versus the, again in the third. So Joel, I appreciate the question. What is it? One thing I'd want to say is there's a lot of, the book is really, it's written in a very personal voice, but there's a lot of dialogue. I'm almost always in dialogue with other authors. And one of my discoveries, embarrassed discoveries, was just how rich the field of feminist moral psychology was around all of these topics. I wrote my dissertation, as you know, on Heidegger and poetry. I've written books on Emerson. My realm of interlocutors always seems to be hopping to a community that doesn't talk about the other authors that I like to read. And then you're sort of like, why are you here? What, the stranger in this house? But so, I was really rocked by Annette Beyer on trust. And that really, I just thought, like, there's a kind of, phenomenology that I believed more than a Husserlian phenomenology in what she was doing. And that got me into, all kinds of other people, including Trudy Gaudier and Karen Jones. And that was like a massive education. And then I think the other thing is, particularly on forgiveness and hope, I was in dialogue with quote unquote Black thought far more extensively than I'd been in any of the other things I had written, because I sort of had to be in order to negotiate that. the Keep Hope Alive speech by Jesse Jackson was really fundamental for me to think about its vulnerability. And like I said, King on forgiveness is powerful, but he has God to rely on. Since I don't, that was a perfect person to, well, what do I say then? Can I still talk about forgiveness kind of the way he does? If the power of the catalyst is just you and me, and doesn't have that transcendental third to secure us or to keep me honest. And then the last thing is perfectionism is so second order, so much about I'm accounting for how I account. I just decided I was going to make partly it because I was talking about these different authors throughout. I wanted perfectionism to have to take up the question of whiteness. So that's the example of giving an account of yourself as I sort of went through. And that's because I'm not stupid. And I know if I were talking about all these other authors, I was accountable for how I was approaching them. And so really, even though, and then one of the readers was like, hey, what are you doing? He still was unconvinced. And so that's why I put in the aphorism after Du Bois, co-work in the kingdom of culture crisscrosses the color line without erasing. And so there's a lot, I lied, last thing. The heart of the book is exemplification. I'm trying to show what I think being conscientious looks like. Trying to exemplify what a conscientious life is. And a conscientious life can be wrong. But that's sort of the deepest ethical commitment was performing a kind of conscientiousness I formally sketched in some earlier writings. And to show that a conscientious person needs to really inhabit language, but in a way that's factically responsive, not in a way that's just performatively indulgent.